Oh yeah, there's people right back here. They'll clean it and we'll get back in the museum.
Yeah. So you go to the next one, you know.
Yeah, they'll just clean off the crap.
The inertia starter, so you'll be able to start it. That'll be going off along with this lovely Panzer III. It'll go back in the museum. The other vehicles will be staying on the arena for you to come and have a look at. So, a much more common German tank than the Tiger. This is a Panzer III, and this particular model is the L model. Now, those of you who are German tank fans, they kind of go, they start through model numbers or Ausführung. It starts with A, works through. In the Panzer III, they go to the letter N. So each time it's because it's got a new improvement, a new variation, sometimes a new weapon. Now this particular one, the L model we have here, has the longer barreled 50mm gun on the front there, and this particular one was TP'd. In other words, it's stamped TP Tropen. It was meant to go out to North Africa, which is what actually happens to it. We know that this particular tank goes to from Naples to Benghazi in July of 1942. We know it was issued to the 8th Panzer Regiment, which is part of the 15th Panzer Division. In other words, Rommel's Afrika Korps, fighting the British and Commonwealth forces in North Africa. We think it was captured at Alam Halfa, the battle there, and we got photographs of it being debombed out in North Africa by local labour, sent back to Britain for analysis, and pretty much in its entire lifespan it's been a runner. So there's film of this running way back at things like they used to have battle days down here up on the camp area at Gallows Hill, and this would appear and run. So it's a regular runner. Fingers crossed we keep this one going for a fair bit longer. Tropen means that they do things to it to make sure it can work in the hotter climates, obviously in North Africa. Just like this Tiger has got what they call the FIFO air filters to suck in and clean the air of dust before it goes into the engine. Now the Panzer III dates back again to the early 1930s. Hitler comes to power, rips up the Versailles Peace Treaty in 1933. Already the Germans have been experimenting with the Soviet Russians out in Kazan, and they've been doing experiments with what they might like should they be allowed to build a tank. Panzer I, Panzer IIs are really in essence the training tanks for the German military, even though Panzer IIs are built very much with the idea they might be used in combat. Panzer IIIs, this one, and the Panzer IV that was going to have a short-barreled 7.5cm gun on, they are the tanks the Germans wanted to go to war with. Hitler, of course, jumps the gun for the German military. They think they won't be ready till about 1942. Hence, the Germans in 1940 are using an awful lot of their Panzer I and Panzer IIs, some Panzer IIIs, and only a few Panzer IVs. They just don't have them ready enough. Now, the Panzer III, the design philosophy, this is almost like a British cruiser tank. Once you've broken service with the Russian military in about 1940, it's designed in the late 30s by a guy called Koshkin. He comes forward with the idea of a replacement for the BT tank series of the Russians. They were the fast tanks, built with Christie suspension, built in huge numbers out in the Soviet Union. He's tasked with coming up with a new design. He uses sloped armour, angling the armour, not just so that rounds ricochet off, but it actually creates a thicker surface or a thicker depth of armour for an incoming round that's travelling horizontally from another anti-tank gun or another tank. Thickens the armour that's got to go through, and it also gives the point that what you end up doing there is creating a very tight volume inside because of that angled armour. So crew conditions in the Soviet era, let's be honest about it, Stalin would take no arguments, probably worse than Hitler that way, so no one complains that the interior of this vehicle can feel quite cramped once it's fully loaded with all its equipment it carries, and crew conditions are pretty crude. Now they design a new diesel engine to put in the back of this. The turret carried originally the 76mm gun, that's the one you can see inside the museum. By the time they put this into production, the version that you're looking at here is put into production in 1944 because the Germans and the Russians have fought at places like the Battle of Kursk. The Russians now realise they are going to have a more powerful gun on their tanks. Early on in the campaign, that 76mm gun was considered, well, it outclassed most of the German tanks coming the other way. So it did the job. It wasn't capable, though, of penetrating the Panther. Hence, they design a new tank. They were going to call it the T-44. But being the Russians, very sensibly, they decided, no, let's go for an evolutionary approach. Let's carry on building T-34 chassis, but we're going to build a bigger turret. So they create this larger turret. You've now got room, instead of the early ones where you can only fit 2 in, you can actually now get a loader in there as well, rather than the commander and the gunner being pressurised to do everything. This then carries an 85mm gun. Again, if you're not used to tanks, it's the size of the hole at the end of the barrel, so 8.5 centimetres across. It's a longer gun with higher velocity. So the rounds come out with more force behind them. They can therefore, if you're firing a solid lump of metal, which is what tends to be armour piercing, if you're firing that at an enemy tank, it tends to be able to smash through more metal. So the longer the barrel, the higher the velocity, and quite often the larger the calibre, the size of the hole means you're going to get more firepower. Now this T-34, it's having a bit of fun struggling around, it looks at the moment. It's not going too fast, you can see. But this is actually one that was made in Poland after World War II. So huge numbers are made by the Russians during the war. It is considered by many a very successful tank, but also, if you're honest about it, it's also the tank that was knocked out the most in World War II. So large numbers of these are knocked out by German anti-tank guns, by mines, by other German tanks. The simple fact was the Russians could make so many more of them, and their genius was really in simplifying the production. So they cheapen the cost of making a T-34 as the war goes on. They simplify production because they have to move the factories away from the advancing German army. There's a point where some of these Japan, we're not too sure when yet, but this vehicle coming on now is called a Type 95 or a Ha-Go tank, which means third model in Japanese, I'm told. Now, the Ha-Go started production, or the design of it, in the early 1930s. This is a vehicle that, even though lots of times, if you watch the documentaries, everyone will say, well, it wasn't very good, was it? It didn't really stand up to Western tanks like the Sherman that much in the Pacific War. Actually, this was a very advanced design when it comes into service, and it's also one of those vehicles that, again, if it's not got anything much to fight against in terms of other armour, actually, if you're the guy with a tank, it doesn't matter what tank, you're still the guy with the advantage. And that's exactly what the case was for the Japanese military early on in the war, out in places like Manchuria, etc. Now you can see on the vehicle, it's got what's called a 37mm gun. Early models had a 37mm medium velocity, later ones had the same 37mm but a higher velocity gun, and they'd also carry a couple of machine guns. Those are those black, the armoured covers over those machine guns. One's facing forward, one's facing to the rear at the back of the vehicle there.
Oh, blimey.
Now, the chap who designed this sounds like an Irish comedian. His name was actually Tommy O'Hara, and he designed this new suspension system. It's called a bell crank suspension system, and it sort of makes the vehicle rock as it goes along. In the back of it, there's a Mitsubishi diesel engine. It's one of the few tanks, again, in the 30s with diesel in. And again, very cramped. There's only one person in the turret. It's got a three-man crew, driver down the front, there's radio operator and also machine gunner down there as well, squeezed in. And the interior was originally lined with asbestos, and that was to try and keep the heat down. From, again, if it's working in tropical climates, or I say tropical, Far Eastern climates, Pacific Islands, etc., they lined it with asbestos with the idea that that was going to be heat protection. And of course, we now know what problems. So he's finding his notes here. The famous American aeroplane engine that they were using in the Sherman, in some of these earlier vehicles, the Wright W670 engine was used in most of them. The problem, if you can imagine, an aeroplane engine, it's air-cooled, it tends to be big and round, but the drive shaft comes out the middle for turning the propeller. That sounds sensible for an aeroplane engine. The problem is, in this vehicle, it's quite high because that engine in the back means the drive shaft has to go through the vehicle to the front where the gearbox is to drive those toothed wheels. They're the only ones powered by the engine with the teeth on at the front. And that means the hull of the vehicle has to be quite high. Now this is, you can hear that aeroplane engine in the back there. That's the problem about that engine, as I say, because they have to make it high, it means that the transmission, there's a drive shaft and a casing going right down past the driver and the bow machine gunner who sits next to him, and it separates the vehicle. And that was one of the criticisms the British had of it. They make some of these as well with something called a Bovington, a diesel engine in as well, only over about 1,000. Most of them have the aeroplane engine in. And when they originally go into service, they end up with about 4 Browning machine guns on. Now, famously, when they were issued to the first British troops, were using them before the end of 1941 out in the Western Desert. One of the guys who takes it for a test drive comes back and he's asked, what does he think about it? And he comes back and he says, it's a real honey. And that word sticks. In the British forces, out in the desert, they call this a honey because it was such a nice tank. It was reliable. It was something that tended to start on time. So all its faults tended to be overlooked because if the blooming thing works, you know, you'll forgive it most things. So many of the British tanks at this time were very unreliable. And again, from the British point of view, the only scouting vehicles, light tanks, that's going to be the light Mark 6B. We want cruiser tanks that are going to be for exploitation, in other words, speeding behind the enemy lines, doing the damage, but we're also going to have to break into those enemy lines first, like the First World War. And that means we're going to need what the British then decide to call infantry tanks. We start with the Matilda 1, and then we go on to this fellow, the A12, the Matilda 2. And remarkably, we always criticise British tank design so often. This is built relatively quickly and very successfully by Woolwich Arsenal does the designs, they hand it over to a company, again in the 1930s. They're trying to build up a base of a number of different manufacturers because traditionally it's only Vickers building tanks in Britain. If a war's coming, we're going to need more people to build them. So we go to the Vulcan foundry and they build this and get it out really, again, very quickly within a couple of years. And this particular Sherman is the one that appeared, you may have been out listening to Stuart earlier on, it's the one that appeared in the Fury movie, and no doubt I'm about to be told it's stuck. Right, even more important, sod the tanks. Someone has left a dog that's getting very distressed in a white camper van. And we ain't going to do the show anymore until someone stands up and goes and sorts that dog out.
Yay!
And this particular Sherman is the one that appeared, you may have been out listening to Stuart earlier on, It's the one that appeared in the Fury movie, and no doubt I'm about to be told it's stuck. Right, even more important, sod the tanks. Someone has left a dog that's getting very distressed in a white camper van. And we ain't going to do the show anymore until someone stands up and goes and sorts that dog out.
Yay!
In many ways, they haven't got the turret worked out. It's the M4 Sherman that they want to build, and they do build in large quantities. Now this particular Sherman, it's an M4A2E8. So what does all that mean? M4 is the standardised model. A2 means it's got the General Motors 12-cylinder twin diesel in the back. And E8 means it's got horizontal volute spring suspension, HVSS suspension. Easy 8 suspension is the way they tended to call this. And quite often, if you're reading all this, how they take it all apart, they then say brackets 76. And that 76 means it's got the 76mm gun on it, the more powerful gun that comes into service really from, it's just before D-Day. They don't use it in Normandy till after D-Day, the 76mm. Now this is obviously the tank we lent to the Fury movie. In the Fury movie, they've got it done up as an M4A3E8, which was a much more common variant issued to the American forces. Most of the earlier model that I just mentioned, the M4A2E8 version, was actually passed on to the Russians. So the majority the Americans made was given as Lend-Lease and fought in Russia. So this is a bit of a rarity under there, in the sense that not that many ended up with Western forces. Now that twin diesel in the back powers through a drive shaft to the front where the gearbox is, and yet again you can see it's those sprocketed wheels in the front that are being driven by the engine. The only one, the wheels on the ground with that HVSS suspension system, they're just taking the weight of the vehicle, spreading it out over the track. The wheel at the rear is the one that's actually keeping that wider track nice and tight. And again, throughout the Sherman production run, not only are they using, they're coming up, they use 4 different engines. It's just because basically they didn't have enough of that aeroplane engine, the Wright R975 engine, to put in all the different models. So they end up, we're going to see another version in a moment, where they ended up actually just getting car engines, bolting them together, about half 5 of them, and creating again a multi-bank engine. That was part of the problem. It's just creating enough engines for the Sherman production line. And again, the Americans, very clever, they go to the automotive industry instead of heavy steel industry, people like the train manufacturers. They go to Chrysler and they say, look, could you make, in large numbers, like you do cars, tanks? And basically, very quickly, the car industry comes back with designs, with the idea of how to build factory space. Some of that factory space paid for by the British, because we want these tanks as well, and they go into production. And the American really success story about the Sherman is they do it so quickly, with such a large number of tanks, and yet again, a bit like the T-34-85, it isn't tank for tank a match for anything like the Tiger, but it wasn't meant to be. This Imperial on paper, if you're playing top trumps, it should have won. The Panther tanks did not have trained crews. And here is one of those more standard, I would argue, looking Shermans. This one here with the 75mm gun, only a millimetre difference compared to the one behind me, the Fury tank. But again, one of those vehicles that was made in such large numbers worked very, very well for American forces. So to protect where the ammunition was stored, and that was what was causing the fires, they weld extra plates of armour on the side. You can see that this tank has gone through the upgrade programme. Let's protect where the armour plate is, where the ammunition is stored, in the panniers on the side of the vehicle. What they did by the time of the Fury tank behind us, they start doing things called wet stowage. They put the ammunition in a metal bin surrounded by water with an antifreeze in it, and that means if the tank is penetrated, there's less chance the ammunition will cook off. The water should perhaps put out a hot bit of metal so it doesn't cause those secondary fires. And that's what they realised. And so they stopped by later in 44, when wet stowage is coming into service, they stopped so many of the Shermans catching fire. It's a really effective way, and it still goes on to this day. Modern tanks, they have a liquid around where you're storing the cordite or whatever the bag charge is that's going to force the metal round out the end of the barrel. Only later in the war that we really got our own tank design back together, because we relied on the Sherman, and we ended up later in 44 with this tank, the Comet, which is often overlooked but was a cracking tank design and very, very successful. The aircraft got the first priority, pick on engines. We then derated the famous Spitfire engine, the Merlin. They call it a Meteor when it goes in a tank. And all of a sudden we've got an engine with enough power, 600 horsepower, that we can build bigger, heavier, better armoured vehicles. So this Comet tank you're looking at, very good armour protection on the front of it. You're looking there at a vehicle that at one point just got over 10 centimetres of armour on the front turret. That's the equivalent of the front of that Tiger in places. It's got the 77mm high velocity gun. This gun was designed by Vickers. They hoped to put it on the Cromwell, didn't fit, so they designed a new turret. They learned from the Cromwell, they built the Comet. Now, so that new turret has got more room for the gun.
Engine note.
And that gun, firing armour-piercing, discarding sabot rounds, has got more armour penetration capability than the gun on the famous German Panther tank. So it's a very effective gun they put on the vehicle. And it got speed with that 600 horsepower engine, good armour protection. They start issuing it to the troops. British tank units start training with this around Brussels in the late autumn and winter of 1944, early into 45. The Germans then attack in the Battle of the Bulge. And again, this idea about mature technology, about being used to things, they decided to reissue the Sherman tanks to most of the units. They took the Comets away because no one really wanted to go into action with a vehicle they weren't familiar with. So they took them away, reissued them with Shermans, and only issue these earlier in 1945 when they think it's safe to do so. So Comet tanks in British forces only see fighting really from March 1945 to the end of the war, really the Rhine crossing onwards. But a very successful tank, was sold around the world. Burma had them in service till mid-1980s, Finland had them, the Irish Army had some, so again, cracking bit of kit, a bit late from the British Army's point of view of coming into service. Came into service, was designed pretty much, you can see the shape of it, the end of World War II. They put it into mass production, and in the early 1950s, Soviet Russia did a pact with China, Mao's China, communists, and they gave them the plans to build T-54 tanks or T-55A tanks. And this is one of the versions that was built by the Chinese. In Chinese service, it's called a Type 59. And so I don't forget that. They've actually put T, if you look on the side, Type 5 again to help NATO defend the West. They use American equipment to start with and then design this, a Leopard tank. Now what we've actually got in front of you here, the Leopard 1 tank was sold on by Germany to many countries. And Maple Leaf, that's because this served with the Canadian forces. And Canada in the early 2000s decided tanks were old hat, we don't need them anymore, and went to get rid of them. We put our hand up and said, could we have a couple please? And they really kindly gave us 2 of their Leopard tanks. This is one of them. Then Canada went off to fight in Afghanistan and very quickly realised they dropped a big one and went back to Germany and bought more Leopard tanks and put them into service. Just like the Netherlands have, they got rid of their tanks and now they're hiring Leopard tanks again, back off and training with the German military. So a bit of a story there really, or one hopes we learn that lesson, which is if you get rid of your tanks, you tend to very quickly regret it. Now this gun, they use the British 105mm gun, the Germans, when they're designing the Leopard. But what they do, they go the other way from the Tiger. They decide to go for speed. So the original design of the Leopard, the armour protection on the front was supposed to be proof against 20mm, about cannon fire. Don't worry about that, chaps. We're going to make you so fast on the battlefield. We're going to give you a thumping great MTU diesel engine. That's what you can hear rumbling away there. We're going to make you so quick the enemy won't be able to keep up with you to knock you out. That was the argument with the Leopard. Complete opposite of World War II and the Tiger. The Tiger has a powerful gun, so does the Leopard, but it has very thick armour and perhaps, some might argue, not great mobility. The Leopard has gone for that powerful gun, but great mobility, don't worry about the armour. That was the idea. And the Leopard, really, their design was very successful because they kept up the mobility, but also added armour over time. Most likely to meet in combat around the world today. 20,000 of them made. You may recognise it. They've been being used in Syria, in the Middle East, in a number of places. The first one there, that's the T-72 tank. Very low profile, 125mm gun, and it looked like we're following on with our Chapter 1 tank behind it. With this tank, the Soviets have got what they call an auto-loader. They get rid of the guy who has to stand there and put the huge round in the breech of the gun. And when you get rid of that person, it means you can make the tank lower. So look at the profile of this tank. It's very low, which means you're going to be harder to see and harder to hit. And the idea of the T-72 with that auto-loader, this was part of the Soviet Union's deep battle preparations. There would be lots of these T-72 tanks. If the Cold War had become a hot war, they would have been attacking in vast numbers to swap what we like to think in NATO as our better quality tanks. We never had the same number. We tended to go for technology, higher end quality. That doesn't mean to say we would have necessarily won, because there were so many of these T-tanks in service. Again, the Russians tended to train with simpler tanks. These would be ready for wartime use, and off they go. T-72, what looked like a tube on the back of the turret. That's a snorkel, because the Russians realised that NATO would blow up all the bridges over the Rhine, the Neder Rhine, the Wal, all the rivers that go north into the North Sea and the Channel. How are they going to cross those rivers? This is a tank that they train to deep wade. They can put a snorkel on the back of it and they go under the river, through the riverbed and out the other side. It's a tank as well that it was made in Russia. It wasn't supposed to be made. It was supposed to be only made if they went to war. But there was a fudge between two rival tanks. Philosophy after World War II was we are never going to war again with a tank that has less firepower and less armour protection than the enemy. That was one of the lessons we learned from the Tiger and the Panther and later the King Tiger in World War II. So British tanks, we have the Centurion, which is really a World War II tank. We have the Chieftain, massively thick armour, huge 120mm gun. We were going to have a tank called MBT-80. The project was cancelled. The Shah of Iran had ordered a tank from Britain. He was to everyone's surprise at the time, it didn't do badly. In fact, it's got still holds the record for the longest tank-on-tank kill. Came from a Challenger 1. I can't remember, one of you out there will shout it out how long it actually was, but it was a very successful bit of kit that way. Challenger 1 replaced by Challenger 2, the modern British Army's tank, and fairly soon they're going to start the upgrade programme to put a new gun, new turret on Challenger 2 to get Challenger 3. Right, so there's a pretty impressive range of tanks.
The tank is fitted with two starters, an electric one and an inertia starter. And in the manual for the tank, it says if the tank's been stood for any length of time, you must start it on the inertia starter. So it's a very important bit of equipment to have at hand. And also, if the electric starter packs in, then we've got a secondary starter for the tank. It's similar to an aeroplane, when you've seen them starting Spitfires and Hurricanes and Messerschmitts, where they get on the side of the plane and turn the handle at a high degree of knots. And then engage the starter and start the engine. So hopefully that's going to happen this afternoon. We've got two really strong men in the terms of David and Stephen. And what they do is they put the starting handle into the rear of the tank, which drives a chain, which drives a shaft, which then turns the starter. And then they have to press a big button to engage the starter. And we get about 6 turns of the engine. And hopefully it'll fire up. If it doesn't, we'll try the whole system again.
Oof. I'm wobbling all over the show. If only I'd have brought the tripod.
Most of the German tanks were fitted with this auxiliary way of starting the engine. And the British tanks weren't for some reason. They probably had much better starter motors than the Germans. It's a very how can I say, a dodgy starting system on the German tanks. It's too good for its own good, really. And if the batteries aren't completely fully charged, starters burn out really easy. So a second one on Tiger, and second one I think on Panzer 3 as well. So you have to be really careful with the electric starters. It's a big engine and a very small electric starter. So we've got the handle in now, and Dave and Stephen are now going to start the motions in turning it. It starts off really slowly to start with, and then it has to gain speed. I'll check with the driver to make sure the ignition's on.
Do. Yeah, we're going to have to put one way down to
So that's like winding up a clockwork toy.
This is not for the faint-hearted, I assure you. A bit more. Right, okay, try it at that.
Hey!
What do you do?
Right, you've got to go for the gates, really.
Snel makker.